I think you should come home. That's what the electrician said. At first I thought he meant something was wrong with the wiring. Maybe a breaker panel had burned out or something like that. The house is old, built in the early 70s, and the wiring had been acting up for months. But his voice sounded different, careful, like he was choosing every word before saying it. I found something, he added. I remember I was sitting in the small office at the dental clinic where I worked part-time. It was late afternoon, maybe a little after 4. The place was almost empty because most of the patients had already left. What kind of something? I asked. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, very quietly, inside the workshop wall. Another pause. You should come alone. I actually laughed a little when he said that, not because it was funny, more because it sounded like something out of a movie. Is this a joke? I asked. No, he said immediately. I wouldn't joke about something like this. And I could hear in his voice that he meant it. My name is Laura Bennett. I'm 53 years old, and until about a year ago my life was normal, quiet, predictable. My husband Mark and I had been married 22 years before he passed away from a heart attack last spring. Even now, saying that still feels strange. He was only 56. Mark was the kind of man who always had to be working with his hands. When he wasn't at the auto shop where he'd worked most of his life, he was out in that workshop behind our house building something. Shelves, furniture, a little wooden boat once that never actually made it into water. That workshop was his space. And after he died, I couldn't go in there. Not really. I opened the door once about 3 months after the funeral, stood there for maybe 30 seconds, and then closed it again. The smell of sawdust and oil and metal tools was still exactly the same, like he'd just stepped out for coffee. So the workshop stayed locked, until the wiring in the house started acting up this winter. Lights flickering, outlets cutting out, the microwave shutting off randomly. Little things at first, but eventually my son Evan insisted I get someone to look at it. Evan lives in Denver now. He calls every Sunday. Anyway, the electrician I hired was named Daniel Ruiz. He came recommended by our neighbor Diane, who said he'd rewired her whole basement the year before. Nice guy, early 30s maybe, quiet, professional. The first day he came out, he looked at the breaker panel in the garage and said something that stuck with me. Did your husband do electrical work? I said no. Mark was a mechanic. Daniel nodded slowly and said, some of the wiring running to the workshop looks modified. I didn't think much of that at the time. Mark was always tinkering with things. But now, sitting there in the clinic with Daniel on the phone telling me he'd found something hidden in the wall, I suddenly remembered that conversation. What exactly did you find? I asked him again. Another long pause. Then he said, it's better if I show you. That was the moment my stomach started to feel strange. Not fear exactly, just a feeling that something wasn't right. I told my supervisor I needed to leave early and drove home. The whole drive probably took 15 minutes, but it felt longer. I kept thinking maybe Daniel had uncovered old wiring or something unsafe. Maybe he just didn't want to explain it over the phone. That seemed reasonable. But there was one thing I couldn't stop thinking about. The way he said come alone. Looking back now, I probably should have asked more questions right then. But grief does something strange to your thinking. You spend so long trying not to disturb the past that when something from that past suddenly opens up, you don't always react the way you should. When I pulled into the driveway, Daniel's white van was still parked near the garage. The workshop door was open. That alone was unusual. Mark always kept that door closed when he was working, even in summer. I stepped out of the car and walked across the yard. I remember the wind moving through the trees behind the fence, and the sound of something metallic clinking lightly inside the workshop. Daniel was standing just inside the doorway when I walked up. He looked uneasy, not scared, just uncomfortable. Mrs. Bennett, he said. Laura is fine, I told him. He nodded. Laura, I'm sorry if this seems strange. I was removing part of the drywall near the breaker feed to run new cable, and I found a hollow space behind the studs. He stepped aside and gestured for me to come inside. The workshop looked almost exactly the way it had the last time I'd seen it. Tools hanging neatly on the wall. Mark's old red toolbox under the window. His workbench in the back corner. But one thing had changed. A section of drywall behind the workbench had been cut open, about 2 feet wide. And inside that opening, there was a narrow wooden box built between the wall studs. Daniel pointed a flashlight inside it. "I didn't open it," he said quietly. I stepped closer. For a moment I just stared at the box. And then something about it made my chest tighten, because I realized something I hadn't noticed before. That box hadn't been placed there accidentally. My husband had built it into the wall. And whatever was inside it, he had gone to a lot of trouble to hide it. For a few seconds, I didn't say anything. I just stood there staring at that narrow wooden box built between the wall studs. It looked deliberate. That's the best word I can think of. The wood was cut clean, fitted snugly between the beams like part of the structure itself. Whoever installed it knew what they were doing, and that someone was almost certainly my husband. I remember reaching out and touching the edge of the drywall where Daniel had cut it open. The exposed gypsum felt rough and dusty against my fingers. "Was this here the whole time?" I asked. Daniel nodded slowly. "Looks like it," he said. "The drywall was intact until I removed it. No way anyone would have known about it unless they opened the wall." I leaned closer and looked inside again. The box had a small lid hinged on the back. Simple brass hinges. The kind you can buy at any hardware store. But the lid was closed. "You said you didn't open it?" I asked. Daniel shook his head immediately. "No." Then he hesitated. I figured, if it belonged to your husband, it wasn't my place. That was the moment I noticed something else. There was a small metal latch on the front of the lid, and it wasn't locked, which meant it could be opened with one finger. For some reason, that made the whole thing feel heavier, like the room had suddenly gotten quieter. I glanced around the workshop for a second. The late afternoon light was coming through the dusty window over Mark's workbench. It lit up the floating particles of sawdust still hanging in the air. Everything looked exactly the way Mark used to leave it. That part still felt normal. But the wall didn't. I realized Daniel was watching me, waiting for me to decide what to do. "Maybe it's just paperwork," I said out loud. Honestly, I wasn't even sure why I said that. Maybe I was trying to convince myself. Mark wasn't the type to hide things. At least, not in any serious way. The man could barely keep birthday gifts secret for more than 2 days. Daniel didn't respond. He just stood there with the flashlight pointed toward the box. After a few seconds, I sighed and reached inside. My hand hesitated on the lid. I remember thinking, and this might sound strange, but I had the feeling that once I opened that box, something would change. Not physically, just something about how I understood my husband. I almost pulled my hand back, but then I lifted the latch. The small click echoed in the quiet workshop, and I opened the lid. Inside the box were several things. The first thing I noticed was a stack of envelopes tied together with a rubber band. Under those were photographs, and beneath that, a small black case, about the size of a glasses case. None of it looked like tools or workshop materials. It looked personal. Daniel shifted slightly beside me. "Do you want me to step outside?" he asked. I considered that, but for some reason I said, "No, it's fine." I reached in and picked up the envelopes first. There were maybe 15 of them, all plain white. No stamps, no addresses, just sealed envelopes. I turned the stack over in my hands. The paper felt slightly yellowed with age. And then I noticed something written on the top envelope. 3 words. "If anything happens." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" Daniel asked quietly. I didn't answer right away, because I was still staring at the handwriting. It was Mark's. I'd seen that handwriting for over 20 years, grocery lists, birthday cards, little notes he'd leave on the kitchen counter. There was no doubt about it. I slipped the rubber band off and opened the first envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in half. I unfolded it slowly, and I remember thinking how strange it was that my hands had started shaking. The note was short, only 2 sentences, but the moment I read them, something cold ran down my spine. It said, "If someone finds this before Laura does, please make sure she sees what's inside the case. She deserves to know the truth." For a few seconds, I didn't move. Daniel leaned slightly closer. "Everything okay?" I swallowed. "I don't know." Looking back now, there's something I should probably mention. At the time, I assumed the note meant the box itself, the envelopes, the photographs. But later I realized something important. The note specifically mentioned the case. Not the box, not the letters, just the case. And I hadn't opened that yet. I slowly reached into the compartment again and lifted the photographs out. There were maybe 8 or 9 of them. Most looked old, faded colors. The top photo showed Mark standing next to a car in what looked like a parking lot. But the strange part was, I didn't recognize the place. And Mark wasn't alone. Standing next to him was a man I had never seen before. They both looked younger, maybe late 30s. The man had one hand resting on the hood of the car, and both of them were looking directly at the camera, almost like they expected the picture to matter someday. I turned the photo over. On the back, written in the same handwriting as the envelope, were 2 words, "Just in case." I felt Daniel's flashlight shift toward the bottom of the box, toward the small black case. "Is that what the note meant?" he asked. I stayed at it. That little case suddenly felt heavier than everything else combined. And I realized something I hadn't thought about until that moment. Mark had hidden this box inside the wall, which meant he probably expected it to stay hidden, unless something happened. I slowly reached down and picked up the black case, and the moment I felt the weight of it in my hand, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was inside it, my husband had never planned to tell me about it while he was alive. I turned the black case over in my hands for a moment before opening it. It was heavier than it looked, not by a lot, but enough to make me aware there was something solid inside. Daniel was still standing beside me, holding the flashlight. The beam of light rested on the case like it was waiting for the same thing I was. For some reason, I suddenly became very aware of the quiet in the workshop. The faint ticking of the wall clock above Mark's tool rack, the wind brushing against the siding outside, and my own breathing. "You don't have to open it right now," Daniel said gently. I appreciated that he said it like a suggestion, not pressure. But the truth is, once I held that case in my hands, there was no way I was putting it back without knowing. I flipped the small clasp. It opened with a soft snap. Inside the case was a flash drive. Just a simple black USB flash drive sitting in the mold foam. That was it. I stayed at it for a few seconds, trying to process why Mark would go to the trouble of hiding a single flash drive inside a wall. Daniel leaned in slightly. "A USB drive," he said. "Looks like it." He scratched the back of his neck. "Well, that's not what I expected." "Me neither." But honestly, the longer I looked at it, the more uneasy I felt. Mark wasn't particularly tech-savvy. He could use a computer well enough, emails, YouTube tutorials, that kind of thing, but he wasn't the type to store important things on flash drives. At least, not that I knew of. I closed the case slowly. Something about opening that drive right there in the workshop didn't feel right. "Do you have a computer inside?" Daniel asked. "In the house." He nodded. "You might want to see what's on it." I remember hesitating, not because I didn't want to know, but because the note in the envelope had used the word truth. And that word can mean a lot of things. "I'll look at it later," I said. Daniel didn't push it. He just stepped back a little as I placed the photographs and envelopes back into the box for the moment. Actually, that's not entirely true. I did keep the flash drive. And the photos. I only left the empty envelopes behind in the wall. I remember thinking I'd sort through everything later that evening. Looking back now, there's something I should probably admit. At that moment, I still didn't believe any of it meant something serious. People hide strange things sometimes. Old memories. Personal letters. I figured maybe Mark had saved files on the drive, photos, maybe videos he didn't want lost. That seemed like the simplest explanation. And when you've just lost someone, you tend to prefer the simplest explanations. Daniel cleared his throat. What do you want me to do about the wall? Oh, I said, snapping out of my thoughts. Sorry. I looked at the open section of drywall. You can finish the wiring and patch it up. He nodded. All right. Then he paused. I know this might sound strange, he said, but are you okay? I thought about that question for a moment. Yeah, I said, but I'm pretty sure my voice didn't sound convincing. Daniel packed up his tools over the next 20 minutes while I sat on the small stool near Mark's workbench. The workshop felt different now. Not physically, but emotionally, like a room that had just revealed a secret. At one point I noticed something else I hadn't mentioned yet. The smell in the workshop. Mark always kept a small radio on the shelf by the window. It had a faint hum even when it was off. And for some reason, that day the smell of machine oil seemed stronger than usual. Or maybe I just noticed it more. It's strange what your brain focuses on when something unsettles you. Eventually Daniel finished for the day. I'll come back tomorrow to finish the panel work, he said. Okay. He paused at the door. If that drive contains anything concerning, you might want to call someone you trust. I nodded. Thank you. After he left, the workshop was quiet again. Completely quiet. I sat there for another few minutes holding the black case in my hands. And something from years earlier suddenly crossed my mind. It was a memory I hadn't thought about in a long time. About 15 years ago, Mark had come home very late one night, past midnight, which was unusual for him. When I asked where he'd been, he said he'd helped a friend with a car breakdown outside town. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? But I remember one small detail from that night. His hands were shaking slightly. At the time I assumed he was just tired. Looking back now, I'm not so sure. I finally stood up and walked toward the house. The sun had almost set by then. The kitchen lights were already on. And for some reason I had the strange feeling that once I plugged that flash drive into my computer, I might learn something about my husband that I wasn't ready to hear. But the note in the envelope had said something very specific. She deserves to know the truth. I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop. The black flash drive rested in my hand for a few seconds. Then I plugged it in. The computer made the small chime sound, and one folder appeared on the screen. Just one. It was labeled with a date. September 14th, 2009. My chest tightened, because the moment I saw that date, I realized something that made the room suddenly feel colder. September 14th, 2009. Was the night Mark came home after midnight. The night he said he'd helped a friend with a broken car. And I suddenly had the feeling that whatever was inside that folder was going to explain where he had really been. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. The folder sat there on my laptop like it had been waiting 15 years for someone to click it. September 14th, 2009. I leaned back slightly in the chair. There's something strange about seeing a date from the past tied to a memory you thought was ordinary. Your mind starts replaying everything around it, what the weather was like, what you were doing that day, little details you didn't think mattered. I remember that day clearly now. It had been a Monday. Mark left for work around 7 in the morning like he always did. I worked a half shift at the clinic that day, then stopped at the grocery store on the way home. Nothing unusual. That evening we had dinner together. Spaghetti, I think. Actually, no, I'm pretty sure it was meatloaf. Mark loved meatloaf. I only remember that because he made a joke about how my recipe had improved since we first got married. Anyway, around 8 that night he got a phone call. He stepped outside to take it. At the time, I didn't think much of that either. The house was small, and sometimes he stepped outside for calls if the TV was on. When he came back in, he said a friend from the old auto shop had broken down outside town and needed help. Then he grabbed his jacket and left. That was the story. And I believed it for 15 years. Now I was sitting at the kitchen table staring at a folder with that exact date. My finger hovered over the mouse. I remember thinking something very clearly in that moment. If I open this, there's no pretending anymore. But the note had said I deserved to know. So I clicked the folder. Inside were 3 files, 2 video files, and 1 document. I stared at the file names for a few seconds. They weren't labeled with anything descriptive. Just simple numbers. VID_01. VID_02. And a document called Notes. I opened the document first. Maybe because reading felt less confrontational than watching a video. The file opened in a plain text window. At the top of the page were 3 lines. Just 3. And I immediately recognized the writing style. It was Mark. Not handwriting this time. Typed, but the way he wrote sentences. Short. Direct. The note said, "If Laura is reading this, it means I never found the right time to tell her myself." My throat tightened. The next line said, "What happened that night wasn't supposed to involve us." I blinked. Us. I kept reading. But once you see something like that, you can't pretend it didn't happen. I leaned back again, suddenly aware that my heart was beating faster. What was he talking about? The last line read, "Start with the first video." That was it. No explanation. No context. Just that instruction. I sat there for a few seconds trying to process what I'd just read. Part of me expected something mundane. Maybe he'd witnessed some kind of accident. Maybe this was documentation for insurance or something. But if that was the case, why hide it in a wall? Why write a message saying he never found the right time to tell me? I clicked the first video. The screen went black for a moment. Then the image appeared. The video was shaky, clearly recorded from inside a car. The timestamp in the corner read 11:47 p.m. Street lights passed through the windshield. The camera was angled slightly toward the passenger side window. At first I couldn't see much. Just a quiet road. And the faint hum of an engine. Then Mark's voice came from behind the camera. "I'm recording this just in case," he said. Hearing his voice again like that, it stopped me cold for a second. I hadn't heard a recording of him since before he died. His voice sounded exactly the same. Calm. Focused. But there was something else in it too. Tension. The video continued. The car slowed. And the headlights illuminated something ahead. 2 vehicles stopped on the side of the road. One looked like a dark sedan. The other. I leaned closer to the screen. The second vehicle was a pickup truck, parked at an angle across the shoulder. Mark's voice spoke again. "That's them." My stomach tightened, because that sentence made it sound like he knew what he was about to see. The video zoomed slightly as the car rolled closer. 2 men were standing near the sedan. One of them looked like he was arguing with someone inside the car. The other man was standing a few feet away, watching. Then something happened very quickly. The arguing man suddenly reached into the sedan. There was a loud shout, and the second man stepped forward. For a moment the camera shook. Mark whispered something under his breath. I couldn't make out the words. Then the scene froze for a split second as the headlights hit the group directly. And that's when I noticed something. The second man, the one standing back and watching. His face turned toward the car where Mark was recording. And for just a moment, the camera captured his face clearly. I felt my stomach drop, because I recognized him. Not from my life, but from the photograph I had found in the hidden box earlier that afternoon. The same man standing beside Mark. The same one I had never seen before. But that wasn't the part that made my hands go cold. The man in the video wasn't just watching. He was holding something. Something metallic. And the moment the headlights hit it, I realized it was a gun. I paused the video. Not because I meant to, exactly. My hand just moved to the trackpad on its own and the screen froze on that frame. The man standing beside the sedan. The gun in his hand. His face turned slightly toward Mark's headlights. And I realized something strange about the image. He didn't look surprised to see the car. He looked annoyed, like someone had interrupted something. I sat there staring at that frozen frame for a few seconds. Then I slowly pressed play again. The video continued. The man with the gun stepped forward toward the sedan. The other man was still half leaning into the driver's side window, shouting at someone inside. Mark's voice came from behind the camera again, very quiet this time. I should probably leave. But he didn't. The car kept rolling forward slowly, not aggressively, just enough that the headlights stayed on the scene. And then the man with the gun turned fully toward Mark's car. For a second I thought he might raise the weapon. Instead he did something else. He lifted his hand and made a quick motion, like a signal. The man arguing at the sedan immediately stopped. He stepped back from the car. Then both of them turned toward Mark's headlights. The video shook slightly as Mark muttered something under his breath. I leaned closer to the screen, because suddenly the camera zoomed again. Not perfectly. Mark was clearly using one hand, but enough that the men's faces filled the frame. And I saw something I hadn't expected. The man who had been shouting looked nervous, but the man with the gun looked calm, almost controlled. Then the calm man stepped forward and raised his free hand, palm out, like he was telling Mark to stop the car. The video cut abruptly. For a moment the screen went black. Then a new clip started automatically. The timestamp in the corner read 11:53 p.m., so about 6 minutes later. The camera was still inside Mark's car, but the angle had changed slightly. This time the sedan and pickup were behind him in the distance. The road ahead was empty. Mark was breathing heavier than before. "You shouldn't have done that," he said quietly. It took me a second to realize he wasn't talking to himself. Someone else was in the car. The camera shifted slightly, and that's when the passenger side door came into view. Someone was sitting there. I felt my chest tighten, because for a moment the person's face was outside the frame. Just a shoulder, a jacket sleeve. Then the passenger leaned forward, and the camera finally captured him. It was the same man from the roadside, the one holding the gun, now sitting calmly in the passenger seat of my husband's car. I froze. Actually, I think I stopped breathing for a second, because this wasn't what I had expected at all. I had assumed Mark had recorded the scene from a distance, witnessed something dangerous and left. But now the video was showing something completely different. The man spoke. His voice was low, controlled. "You were recording?" Mark didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Just in case." There was a small pause. The man glanced at the camera. Then he reached over and gently pushed it downward so it pointed toward the dashboard. The video angle changed, but the audio kept recording. "You shouldn't keep that," the man said. "It's already recorded," Mark replied. Another pause. Then the man sighed. Not angrily, almost tired. "You're not part of this," he said. "That's exactly why I recorded it," Mark answered. There was silence for a few seconds. I remember leaning closer to the laptop, trying to hear every word, because suddenly it felt like I was eavesdropping on something that had never been meant for me. Then the man spoke again. "If you give me the drive," he said, "this ends hey." Mark didn't respond right away. The car engine hummed quietly. Finally Mark said something that made my stomach twist. "No." Another long pause. Then the man said something very slowly. "You don't understand what you just filmed." Mark let out a quiet breath. "Maybe not," he said, "but if something happens to me, someone will." The man didn't reply. For several seconds the only sound was the road under the tires. Then the passenger spoke again. His voice softer this time. "What's your name?" "Mark." Another pause. Then the man said something that made my skin go cold. "Mark, if that drive ever shows up anywhere, people will come looking for you." The video ended there. The screen returned to the folder. And suddenly the kitchen felt incredibly quiet. I sat there staring at the laptop, trying to process what I had just watched. My husband had filmed something serious enough that a man with a gun had gotten into his car and demanded the recording. And Mark had refused. Then I remembered something else. The photograph. The one I had found in the hidden box. Mark standing next to that same man, smiling like they knew each other, which meant something I hadn't considered until that moment. That roadside encounter in the video probably wasn't the first time they had met. And as I sat there trying to piece this together, another thought crossed my mind. The video file was called VID_02, which meant there was still VID_01. And suddenly I had a feeling that whatever was in that first video might explain how my husband knew the man with the gun in the first place. For a while, I didn't click the next video. I just sat there staring at the screen. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Honestly, the refrigerator hummed softly behind me, and somewhere outside a car passed on the street. Normal sounds. Everyday sounds. But the things I had just seen on that video didn't feel normal at all. My husband had recorded a confrontation on a dark roadside. A man with a gun had gotten into his car, and the two of them had spoken like they already knew each other. That part kept circling in my head, because the photograph I found earlier showed the same man standing beside Mark like they were friends, or at least familiar, which meant something I hadn't been ready to admit yet. Mark hadn't just stumbled onto something that night. He had gone there knowing who those men were. I looked back at the folder on the screen. VID_01. The first video. If Mark's note was correct, this was where everything started. I moved the cursor slowly, then clicked. The screen flickered for a moment before the video began. The timestamp in the corner read 11:22 p.m., so about 25 minutes before the scene from the other clip. The camera was again inside Mark's car, but this time the car wasn't moving. The headlights were off, and the video was darker. It looked like he had parked somewhere along the side of a road. For a few seconds nothing happened. Then Mark spoke. "I'm already here." His voice sounded tense, but controlled. And then another voice answered, not from the phone, from outside the car. "I see you." The passenger door opened. The interior light flicked on, and the same man from the other video stepped inside. The man with the gun. Except this time, he wasn't holding a weapon. He closed the door and sat back in the seat like he'd done it 100 times before, which told me something else right away. This meeting had been planned. The man leaned back slightly and glanced around the car. "Still recording everything?" he asked. Mark didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Habit." The man smirked a little. "You always were cautious." There was that word again. Always. Like they had history. The man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to Mark. "There," he said. "That's the last of it." Mark didn't take it right away. "What's in it?" he asked. The man gave a small shrug. "Proof." Finally Mark accepted the envelope. The camera angle dipped slightly as he looked inside. I couldn't see what was in it from the video, but Mark inhaled sharply. "Jesus," he muttered. The man looked out the windshield. "I told you it was bad." Mark was quiet for a moment. Then he asked something that made my hands tighten on the edge of the table. "How long has this been going on?" The man hesitated. "A while." "That's not an answer." The man sighed. "Long enough that walking away isn't simple anymore." There was silence in the car for a few seconds. Then Mark spoke again. "You could go to the police." The man actually laughed at that. Not loudly, but the kind of laugh someone makes when an idea sounds completely impossible. "Mark, if the police could fix this, I wouldn't be sitting in your car." I leaned closer to the screen, because the tone of the conversation had shifted. It wasn't just tense anymore. It felt dangerous. Then the man said something I wasn't expecting. "You shouldn't have come tonight." Mark frowned. "You called me." "I know." "Then why say that?" The man looked at him for a moment before answering. "Because once you know what's in that envelope, you're part of it too." My chest tightened. Mark stared at the envelope in his hands. "What exactly did you drag me into?" The man shook his head slowly. "I didn't drag you into anything." He gestured toward the envelope. "You insisted on seeing the proof." That word again. Proof. And suddenly the memory of the document on the flash drive flashed through my mind. The note Mark had written. What happened that night wasn't supposed to involve us. The video continued. Mark folded the envelope closed and placed it on the dashboard. You should turn yourself in, he said again. The man looked tired. I can't. Why? Another pause. Then the man spoke very quietly. Because the people behind this, they don't disappear when someone gets arrested. Mark was silent. Outside the car, headlights appeared in the distance. Another vehicle approaching. The man noticed it too. That'll be them, he said. Mark's head snapped up. Them. The man reached for the door handle. Listen to me carefully, he said. If anything happens tonight, keep that envelope. Mark looked confused. What are you talking about? The man opened the door. Then he paused and said something that made the back of my neck prickle. Because someday you might need proof that you weren't part of this. The man stepped out of the car, and the video ended. I stared at the screen for a long time after it went black, trying to piece together what I had just seen. 2 videos, a meeting, an envelope full of something called proof, and a roadside confrontation 20 minutes later. Then I remembered something. The hidden box in the wall, the envelopes, the photographs, the black case. Mark had kept that flash drive hidden for 15 years. Which meant he believed whatever was on it was important enough to protect. But suddenly another thought crossed my mind. The man in the video had said something very specific. If that drive ever shows up anywhere, people will come looking for you. I looked around my quiet kitchen. The house suddenly felt different, like the walls themselves were listening. And for the first time that night, I wondered if hiding that drive inside the workshop wall had been Mark's way of protecting me. Or warning me. I didn't sleep much that night. Actually, that's not quite accurate. I went to bed around midnight, but I don't think I slept more than an hour or 2. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed those videos. The roadside, the man with the gun, the envelope Mark had been handed, and the thing that kept bothering me most, the way the man had said them. That'll be them. Plural. Meaning more people had been involved that night than just the 2 men I saw on the road. Around 3 in the morning, I got out of bed and went back to the kitchen. The laptop was still sitting on the table, the flash drive still plugged into the side. For a moment I considered pulling it out and putting everything back in the box, pretending I hadn't seen any of it, but that wasn't really an option anymore. Once you start asking questions about something like that, you can't just stop halfway. So instead I did something else. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts. There was one person I thought might know something. Greg Halpern. Mark had worked with Greg at the auto shop for almost 15 years. They weren't best friends exactly, but they had known each other a long time. If Mark had been involved in something serious, Greg might have heard something about it. I didn't call him right away. 3 in the morning would have been ridiculous. But I did send a message asking if we could talk the next day. Then I sat there in the quiet kitchen until sunrise. The next morning Daniel came back to finish the wiring in the workshop. I almost forgot about that, which probably sounds strange, but after what I'd seen on those videos, the workshop itself felt like the least important part of the situation. Still, when he knocked on the back door around 9, I let him in. You look tired, he said. I didn't sleep much. He nodded like that made sense. Did you check the drive? I hesitated. Yeah. Daniel waited. What was on it? For a second I considered telling him everything, but the truth is, I didn't know Daniel very well. He seemed like a good person, but this situation suddenly felt bigger. Old recordings, I said. That's all. He studied my face for a moment. I think he could tell there was more to it, but he didn't press. I'll finish patching the wall today, he said. Okay. While he worked in the workshop, I stayed in the house making coffee and trying to decide what to do next. Around 11 my phone buzzed. It was Greg. Call me when you can. I stepped outside onto the back porch before dialing. Greg answered on the second ring. Laura. Hi, Greg. Everything all right? His voice sounded concerned, which surprised me a little. I hope so, I said. There was a pause. What's going on? I took a breath. I was going through some of Mark's things yesterday. Okay. And I found something that made me think you might know more about it. Another pause. What kind of thing? I hesitated. Then I asked a question instead. Greg, did Mark ever talk to you about someone named? Actually, I stopped myself right there, because I realized something strange. I didn't know the man's name. Not the man from the video. Not the man in the photograph. I had watched him sit in my husband's car, hold a gun on the side of a road, and talk about people who might come looking for him. But I didn't know his name. So I described him instead. Tall guy, I said slowly. Dark hair. Maybe early 40s back then. Mark took a picture with him once. Greg didn't answer right away. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. Where did you see that photo? In the workshop. Another pause. Longer this time. Greg. I said. He exhaled slowly. Laura, what exactly did you find? That question told me something immediately. Greg already had an idea. I found a box hidden in the wall, I said. The line went completely silent. For a few seconds I thought the call had dropped. Then Greg spoke again. But his voice had changed. It sounded careful. You should probably stop looking into that. My heart started beating faster. Why? Another pause. Because some things are better left where they were. That answer made me angry. Greg, if my husband was involved in something dangerous, I deserve to know. I'm not saying he was involved. Then what are you saying? Greg hesitated again. Finally he said something that made my skin prickle. I'm saying your husband tried very hard to stay out of it. I gripped the phone tighter. Out of what? Greg didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. Laura, did Mark ever tell you about the fire? I blinked. What fire? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Greg said something that made my chest tighten. The warehouse fire in 2009. My mind raced. 2009. The same year as the videos. No, I said quietly. Greg sighed. That's what I was afraid of. Afraid of what? He didn't answer right away. Then he said something that made the entire situation suddenly feel bigger. Because if you're finding those recordings now. He paused. And if that drive still exists. My stomach tightened. What about it? Greg lowered his voice. Then you might be holding the only evidence left of what really happened that night. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Greg's words just hung there in the air between us. The only evidence left. What warehouse fire? I finally asked. Greg let out a slow breath on the other end of the line. You really never heard about it? No. Well, most people didn't, he said. It was in the news for maybe a day. Small industrial warehouse outside the county line. Fire department ruled it accidental. My stomach tightened. But it wasn't accidental. I asked. Greg hesitated. That depends on who you ask. Greg. He sighed again. All right, but you didn't hear this from me. I sat down on the porch steps. Back in 2009, he continued, there was a storage facility out past Ridgeway Road. Officially, it was used for importing automotive parts. That detail caught my attention immediately. Mark worked in the auto business his whole life. But unofficially, Greg continued, some other things were moving through that place. Like what? Money, stolen equipment, stuff that didn't exactly have paperwork. I felt my chest tighten. You're saying it was a criminal operation? Yeah. And Mark knew about it? No, Greg said quickly. That's the thing. He didn't. Greg paused before continuing. The guy you're describing, tall, dark hair, that was probably Victor Kane. The name felt heavy the moment he said it. Who was he? Used to work with us years ago, Greg said. Not at the shop, more like around the industry. He was always moving parts, making deals. Nothing illegal on the surface. But underneath. Greg didn't answer directly. Victor got mixed up with some people who were using that warehouse. At some point, he realized things had gone way past smuggling. My stomach tightened. How far? Greg lowered his voice. There were rumors about weapons shipments, stuff being moved through the country without anyone noticing. I looked back at the house. Suddenly it felt like the quiet suburban street I'd lived on for 20 years had shifted slightly out of focus. And Mark got involved somehow. Greg was quiet for a second. No, he said finally. Victor asked him for help. Help with what? Victor had figured out that the people running the warehouse were planning to destroy the place, burn it down to erase everything. My mind jumped immediately to the videos. The envelope, I whispered. What? Victor gave Mark an envelope in the car. Greg went silent. Laura, you saw that? Yes. He exhaled slowly. Then that envelope probably had documents, shipping records, names. Proof, I said quietly. Greg didn't respond. But he didn't need to. Victor wanted Mark to keep it. I asked. Probably. But why Mark? Because Mark wasn't part of their world, Greg said. He was just a mechanic with a reputation for being honest. Greg paused before adding something that hit me hard. Your husband had a way of making people trust him. I stared out at the yard. So Victor gave Mark the evidence. Yeah. And then what? Greg's voice dropped again. That same night the warehouse burned down. A chill ran down my spine. People died. I asked. No official reports, Greg said, but a few of the men connected to the operation disappeared after that. My mind replayed the video of the roadside confrontation, the two vehicles, the tension. Those men Mark filmed, I said slowly. They might have been involved. That would be my guess, Greg said. But then why wasn't Mark ever questioned? I asked. Because the fire department ruled it an accident, and no one knew Mark had those documents. I looked back toward the workshop. Except Mark did have them. He had hidden the evidence in the wall. For 15 years. Greg, I said quietly, the envelope Victor gave him. I never found it. Greg didn't answer. Only the flash drive, I continued. Photos. Notes. But no documents. There was a long pause. Then Greg said something very slowly. Laura, are you sure about that? Yes. Another pause. Then your husband probably did exactly what Victor asked. What do you mean? Greg's voice softened. He made sure the proof survived. That answer confused me. But if the documents aren't in the box, then it hit me. The envelopes, the ones I had put back in the wall, the ones I hadn't opened. I stood up so quickly the chair scraped across the porch. Greg, I have to go. What's wrong? I think Mark left something else behind. I hung up and walked straight to the workshop. Daniel had just finished patching the drywall. The wall looked almost normal again, but the opening was still exposed where the hidden compartment had been. The envelopes were still sitting inside. I pulled them out and brought them back to the kitchen table. My hands were shaking a little now. There were about 15 envelopes. Plain white. Sealed. I opened the first one. Inside was a photocopy of a shipping manifest. Names. Dates. Container numbers. The second envelope contained photographs. Warehouse interiors. Shipping crates. The third envelope had handwritten notes. And suddenly I understood. Mark hadn't kept the evidence in one place. He had divided it, spread it across multiple envelopes. If someone ever found one piece, they wouldn't have the whole story. But if someone found all of them, the truth would still exist. I sat there staring at the papers for a long time. Then I remembered something from the note Mark had written. If Laura is reading this, it means I never found the right time to tell her myself. I realized something in that moment. Mark hadn't been hiding a secret life from me. He had been protecting something dangerous, and maybe protecting me too. Eventually I called Detective Alan Pierce. He came by the next day, took copies of everything, the videos, the documents, the photographs. An investigation reopened quietly a few months later. I don't know everything that came from it. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to. But I do know one thing now. The man I was married to for 22 years wasn't hiding something shameful. He was carrying something heavy, something he never wanted to burden his family with. And sometimes I still think about that workshop wall. How something so small stayed hidden for so many years, until one electrician accidentally opened it. Which brings me to something I still wonder about sometimes. If you discovered something like that about someone you loved, would it change how you remember them? Or would it make you respect them more? So that's my story. Folks, if it resonated with you, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Sometimes the people we think we know best are quietly carrying the heaviest truths.